Readings. Today, a few chapters from the book titled Fiela's Child by Dalene, Matthee. Chapter 1. The day the child disappeared, the fog came up early, and by midday it seemed as if the forest was covered in a thick white cloud. Elias Van Rooyen put down his axe and went to sit in the shed on the pile of yellow wood beams that had already been finished. It was no good working when the fog was that thick. The wood got damp and would not yield to the axe. And besides, he did not believe in a man working himself to death, as the woodcutters did. He believed in a good plan and a bit of luck, although luck was rare in the forest. "Barda," he cried towards the house, "bring me some coffee. I'm done for." The fog was really thick. He could only just make out the house from the shed, just enough to see that he would have to fix the roof before the coming winter, before the whole lot collapsed on top of them. Somehow he would have to get a hold of a few second-hand sheets of corrugated iron. The winter before, Barda had kept on moaning about the children sniffing and coughing because of the damp in the wooden house. Of the 4 families that had built houses on Barnard's Island, he was the only one who was not a woodcutter. And he was the only one that had earned real money instead of having to barter for everything with the 2 wood buyers in the village. Not that he thought of himself much better off than the woodcutters, for the money he made from the beams he cut was only just enough to live on if he trapped the meat for the pot himself. But making beams was far easier than cutting wood, and it also meant that you could sleep in your own bed every night instead of in a shack somewhere in the forest. When he heard Barda coming with the coffee, he quickly grabbed the hatchet and examined the handle so as to look busy. Barda could never understand that you sometimes had to sit down quietly in order to think properly. "Elias, isn't Lucas with you?" she asked, standing at the open end of the shed with the coffee and looking worried. "No, you can put the coffee down on the block there. I've got my hands full." She was still good-looking, he thought to himself as she walked slowly away. She would have to get some shoes. Perhaps he could get Christian Small's eldest boy from the Lily Valley bush to come and help him at the beams so he could produce more. Christian's boy was used to working for coffee and sugar and meal and might as well learn from him. On the other hand, it meant putting him up, and the house was too small as it was. The children were getting big, and before long he would have to get some planks and add a 3rd room. Christian's boy could not walk from Lily Valley bush every day. He would only get to work at sundown. He started thinking further ahead. The only way a man could make himself a decent bit of extra in the forest was to buy a gun and shoot elephants. Big feet. For the tusks. How do you get money for a gun, powder, and shot? How do you get past the wood buyers in the village to get the tusks and to the ships to sell them? The ships paid well for ivory, but according to the buyers, they were the only ones with licenses to deliver anything to them. Martins Williams had told him it was a bloody lie, for the wood buyers had to smuggle the elephant tusks to the ships too. Pa, Willem, the oldest of his 4 children, came in under the shed. "Pa, Ma says Lucas is not in the house. Go and see if he's with Aunt Mally, and blow your nose. If you did get to the ships at night and deliver the tusks, how did you get back to the forest afterwards in the dark without the elephants trampling you?" To the north of the clearing, he heard Anna Olwage shouting at a bunch of her children as usual. Maybe he should get Anna and David's oldest boy, Kranzy, to come help him at the beams. Kranzy was a lad of about 15, and David's team had too many hands as it was. They were struggling. "Pa, Lucas isn't with Aunt Molly. Did you ask at Anna's place?" "No, Pa." "Why do I have to tell you what to do all the time?" "Yes, Pa." A man had to struggle until his children were big enough to help him, and there was still a long way ahead for him. Willem, his oldest, was only 6, and Christoffel 5. Lucas was 3, and Nina still on the breast. Willem was old enough to help Barda in the vegetable garden, but the children were of little use to him yet. He would ask David about Kranzy. The boy would have it easy with him. Making beams was not ox labor like cutting wood, sawing it, dragging it out to load it on the wagon, and then getting it to the village. "Elias?" Barda emerged from the fog like a ghost. What is it this time, woman? Couldn't they see that he was busy? Have you seen the child? I told you he wasn't here, and I'm sure you haven't looked everywhere. Go and see if he's with Sophie. I've been to Sophie's. He isn't there. Half an hour later, all was confusion. Women were searching and calling out. People were running into each other in the fog, their faces filled with anxiety. Everyone was asking, "Have you found him yet?" He told them the child must be somewhere in one of the houses, that he must have fallen asleep somewhere. If they would only stop carrying on like this and give him a chance to look for the child properly, they would soon find him. If only the fog would clear a bit so that everything did not look so misshapen. And if only Barda would not keep on walking up and down, calling out as she did. The child was not missing. And then Molly had to come and make things worse. It happened to my aunt back in Karatara's bush. She thought the child had gone with the others to collect firewood, and by the time she discovered that he was missing, it was late afternoon. It took them more than a week to find the little body, frozen to death. We all went to the funeral. Barda put her fist up to her mouth and bit into her knuckles. "How often must I tell you that the child is not missing?" he said, for the 100th time. "Go back to your houses, all of you. Look under every bed and search everywhere." "We've already done that, Elias," Sophie van Hoosteen said. "Go and look again." Old Aunt Gertie, Anna's mother-in-law, took Nita from Barda. Barda didn't even seem to notice. "I don't understand how you could have let the child out of your sight, Barda," he scolded in despair. "I was trying to get the fire going, Elias. The wood was damp. I thought the child was with you." He went into the forest at the south end of the clearing, calling out as he walked. "The child is not missing," he told himself, trying to repress his fears. "The child is not missing." He went to the west side of the island, then east. Every time he walked a little deeper into the undergrowth. When he searched to the north, Aunt Gertie called to him, calling the child's name. "He can't hear us because of the fog, Auntie," he said. It was getting harder not to worry. "The child must be playing somewhere." "Elias, we must turn back. Anna will have to fetch the men. They must come and help us search before it's too late." "But they're cutting a drake loaf, Aunt Gertie," he said, trying to stop her. "It's 4 hours. Walking from here, the child is not missing. You're imagining things." The child is missing. The way she said it, her certainty, shattered the last of his resistance. When you grew up in the forest, you knew what awaited a child that wandered from the footpath or a sled path when there was no one with him. When the fog closed in, you kept your children in the house. "I can't understand how he would have just disappeared, Aunt Gertie. I can't believe it." He was still trying to deny it. "A child, Elias, is like a tortoise. You think he's slow, but he's gone before you know it. Anna must go and fetch the men. I'll go myself." "No. Barda's going to need you. Anna will go. She knows the footpaths and she knows what to do when there are big feet along the way." Molly and Sophie and he searched and called out for the child until dark. Aunt Gertie stayed with Barda. They put Barda to bed and gave her some wild bogu tea every now and again and saw to it that she stayed warm. Later it seemed as if she could no longer cry. She just made the most awful sounds, like a puppy dog whimpering. He told her to stop it. They would find the child. But the house became like a house of death. Aunt Gertie sent someone to fetch ash bread from her house. Sophie brought a brew and coffee and took Nina home with her. Molly brought a bowl of honey and a few cooked sweet potatoes. Willem and Christoffel stood bewildered in front of the hearth. The last I saw of little Lucas was at the corner of the house when Ma was giving him a sweet potato. He stood there eating it. Willem kept saying, "Christoffel, where did you last see him?" "Here in the house, Pa. He was playing with his stones." Molly laughed, despairing. Oh, the good Lord in heaven could know the whereabouts of a child in this vast forest tonight. The same thing happened to my aunt at Katara. "I don't understand it, Molly. I should have at least found his tracks. There are many children on the island, Elias, many tracks. I still don't understand it." "What about the Flip Lawrence who disappeared at that time? Same kind of fog. They still haven't found a trace of him." "Flip didn't get lost, Molly. Everyone reckons it must have been the big feet that killed him. Flip never would have got lost, but he knew the forest too well." "That's the other thing that's worrying me, Elias. The big feet. All week they've been tearing off bark branches and eating around here. They would not even feel it if they stepped on a child in this dark night." "Elephants don't step on children," Aunt Gertie said. Anna and the men were back at midnight. Molly's husband, Martins, took over and gave the orders while they had something to eat, standing up as they were. "The fog's clearing," Martin said. "I'll clear to the south. David, you go west. Coos in the north to you. Elias, you go east. Every 100 paces we'll call out, and on the 10th call we'll turn back and move over 50 yards or so. Are the lanterns ready, Molly?" "Yes," she said. "Sophie and I got them ready." "What about the big feet?" Aunt Gertie wanted to know. "The nearest ones are in Guna's bush," David said. "We are safe over here." Martins gave the women orders too. "Anna can go and lie down. She's had a hard walk. Aunt Gertie must watch over Barda. Molly, you and Sophie make a big fire in the middle of the island. If the child has fallen asleep somewhere and wakes up, he'll see the glow and come back." By morning, the fog was gone, except for a few patches in the deepest gorges. Sophie's husband, Coos, left for deep walls at daybreak to tell the nearest forester about the missing child. By midday, 14 woodcutters were taking part in the search, and on the next morning, the constable came from the village to help as well. The forester had sent a message to the magistrate of the village. Towards the evening, they had heard the constable calling for help in a gorge near Jonkers Mountain and had to go and get him out, battered and totally lost. When they got him back to the island, he addressed them all. "I'm afraid you will have to accept that the child can no longer be alive." "How can you decide?" Mr. Martins flared up. "Whether a child is alive or not. In this forest, the child is tougher than you think." On the 4th day, 24 men were searching, all of them woodcutters except for Elias and the forester, Mr. Cap. On the 5th day, there were 30. Wherever the news had spread through the forest, the woodcutters laid down their axes and came to help. On the 6th day, there were 40. And at the end of the 8th day, it was Martins who took it upon himself to say what had to be said. He can no longer be alive now. Molly and Sophie had to support Barda between the two of them. Barda looked old and forlorn and exhausted, and she was clothed in black, borrowed from Aunt Gertie. Elias just hung his head and shook it slowly from side to side, as if refusing to admit it to the very end. 7 months later, in August of 1865, heavy rains fell over the forest, and shortly after that the forester came to tell him that the parts of a skeleton belonging to a smallish child had been found amongst the driftwood along the Guna River, but it could have been part of a baboon skeleton. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Benjamin had always known that he was his parents' hand-child. Like the hand lamb, the ewe does not want that he has to be Like the hand lamb, the ewe does not want that has to be hand-fed. He had always known it, but it has never mattered because he was just like David and Tolly and Kitty and Emma in the house. They lived in the Long Kloof, and the Long Kloof lay between the mountains that stretched from west to east for 100 miles long. Wolverkraal was on the sunset side of the kloof, and his mother always said it was on the better side. The only trouble was that the stupid Lagans also lived on that side. End of Chapter 2.